Off the ball. This is News Talk.
Now you're welcome back. So the NBA playoffs are in full swing now. Unlike last year's postseason bubble in Disneyland, these games have been played out in front of a few packed houses and brilliant atmospheres right around the country. The return of fans has been far from smooth, mind. Some of the games beset by flashpoints off the court. The Boston Celtics fan, for instance, who threw a water bottle at Kyrie Irving on Sunday night faces a count of assault and battery. And then some other players in the league, the likes of Russell Westbrook and Trae Young, have been targeted in separate incidents as well. And then on the court, lots of talking points, including defending champions LA Lakers potentially on the brink of an early exit. They are struggling against Phoenix Suns. Happy to say the Ringers' John Gonzalez is with us. Hi, John.
Joe, always good to talk to you.
Likewise. So these fan incidents, I know the Kyrie Irving one in particular, there's history there with Boston, but just the fact that there have been a few of them, is this a thing in NBA down the years, or are we talking about some people maybe just pent up for 18 months and going a bit nuts now that they're out of the house for the first time in a while?
I think a little bit of A and a little bit of B, probably more A though. We've seen over the last few years a number of incidents with the players and fans. Russell Westbrook has had a number of run-ins. I think you and I even talked about it. It might have been maybe, 2 seasons ago when Russell Westbrook had that interaction with a fan who had yelled ostensibly racist things and then was allowed to remain in the arena. But Boston has a long history of this. I lived and worked in Boston for a while, and many years ago I wrote a story about Boston's history of racism and how it intersects with sports. And Bill Russell and Charles Barkley, and you name any athlete really, and they'll tell you a story about something that happened in Boston. Even Marcus Smart, who's a beloved player in Boston a couple of years ago, told a story about how he was stopped at a stoplight and the light went green, and so he was ushering, there's a woman walking across the street with her child, so he yelled out the window to her to hurry up because he didn't want her to get hit by a car. And she yelled back, a racial epithet at him. So I think it happens far too frequently in the NBA and sports in general, but in Boston in specific.
Okay. So, for instance, just to bring people up to speed here, in Trae Young's case, a New York Knicks fan spat at him, which is obviously pretty horrific. And then Russell Westbrook, who's playing with the Washington Wizards, a Philadelphia 76ers fan, poured popcorn on him. In the Kyrie Irving case, so he has history with Boston. He's now with the Brooklyn Nets, who, by the way, are favourite outright to win the NBA championship, the Brooklyn Nets. So we should touch on them in a moment. Kyrie Irving, he spent one season in Boston 2017. I think that ended acrimoniously enough, and Brooklyn Nets were beating Boston here. I think they won overall 4-1. Irving at one point, kind of wiped his shoe on the logo in a pretty deliberate manner. He was getting booed every time he touched the ball. This was all getting a bit unsavoury, and somebody chucked a bottle at him.
Yeah, and I think that there's a line there where we go from, okay, this is fun, and you could play the villain, to something that goes beyond sports, right? I mean, sure, things did not work out for Kyrie in Boston. He had started out as a favorite son. He had said that he wanted to have his number retired and finish his career as a Celtic. And then one season that he played, and then there was another season where he was injured and he didn't, and then he was gone. So I think that there was some pent-up frustration from both ends. It obviously didn't work out on his end from an organization standpoint. And then a fan standpoint, I think that they were frustrated. So the component where Kyrie comes back with the Brooklyn Nets, who are favored to win the NBA championship, and he adopts that villain persona, the heel persona, that part is all good and fun from both sides. But I think when we cross over and we're starting to throw objects at players or scream things that don't have any place in polite society, that's where we go beyond just, the normal antagonistic nature of sports into something that's unsavory.
Yeah, like you mentioned Bill Russell, which has gone back a few years, obviously, but Irving, after the incident, alluded to, quote, underlying racism.
Yeah, and that's something that's been a problem in Boston for a long time now. And I think, my friends from Boston, they've heard about this their entire lives, right? And I think sometimes people in Boston get their backs up about it a little bit. They don't want to be this avatar for racism in sports, especially because the whole of Massachusetts, the state that Boston's in, likes to think about it of itself as this really progressive bastion, right? This forward-thinking place where there are these ideas that aren't as recalcitrant and like hyper right wing that sometimes infects America.
Yeah.
But in Boston, that's still been a problem. I mean, racism has been a problem, citywide, and specifically with how they treat athletes, and especially how they treat athletes who are from out of town.
On the Brooklyn Nets then, so this is Kyrie Irving's team. Formerly the New Jersey Nets, I think. So they're now the Brooklyn Nets. One's very much kind of a pretty sad franchise, living very much in the shadow of the New York Knicks. And now they're a bit of a super power. They have a big three, which is quite not unprecedented, but unusual-ish. Often there might be two big names spearheading a franchise. So they have Kyrie Irving, they have James Harden, and they have Kevin Durant, who was kind of in a similar situation at Golden State. So Durant, Harden, Kyrie Irving, tell us about the Brooklyn Nets 2021.
Yeah, they're really good. I mean, they're scary. If anybody's watched them in the playoffs, this is exactly what was forecast for them. They only played 8 games together during the regular season because of various injuries, because of rest. Kyrie likes to take these in-season sabbaticals sometimes for mental health purposes, and good for him. It's good work if you can get it. But they didn't really know exactly how those pieces were going to mesh because there had been such a limited sample size. But I think anybody who's familiar with each of those individual players, if you stepped back and thought, oh, wow, if you had Kyrie and KD and James Harden on the same team, on paper, that should be absolute gangbusters. And that's what it's been in the playoffs. I mean, you mentioned that they're the favorites to win it all. Sadly enough, my Philadelphia 76ers, despite being the number 1 seed, they just lost Joel Embiid. You would like to think that maybe that they would be the favorites, but it's quite clearly the Nets. When they're healthy and those 3 guys are on the court together, they're nigh unstoppable.
And so, I know LeBron in Miami had Dwayne Wayne and Chris Bosh, for instance, about a decade ago. In those instances, be it Jordan or wasn't there Larry Bird, Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish as well in the 80s with Boston? But in those cases, there's Jordan and there's Bird and there's LeBron, and I guess Steph Curry was very obviously the main man. Is there an obvious alpha main man at Brooklyn?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if Kevin Durant wasn't coming off of a massive surgery and this was his first season back, I would say, right off the top that it was probably Kevin Durant. But with those 3 guys, you could really pick anyone in any situation and say, okay, well, this is going to be the guy for this particular circumstance. And that's what makes them so dangerous. They're all 3 in their own right, just absolutely outstanding players. I think you probably give the edge to KD just because of his defense, though. Both James Harden and Kyrie Irving are absolutely outstanding basketball players offensively and can do so much with the ball. But KD, his defense is really, I think, what sets him apart.
You mentioned something pretty interesting there. Kyrie Irving takes breaks for his own mental health. Obviously, that has been a theme of the week. I think Naomi Osaka has been the big story over here. I suspect it's been a huge story over there as well. So Irving takes time out. Does he give more specifics on why?
No, that's part of Kyrie's brand. I think that sometimes he goes off to be Kyrie Irving and doesn't really apologize to anybody for it. And, I was actually thinking about this earlier today, Joe, before I even knew I was going to be on the show, because Kyrie had mentioned that he was in support of Naomi Osaka doing that, to go off and think about herself and pay attention to her mental health for it. And I think Kyrie Irving gets a lot of heat for a lot of different reasons, but on this specific topic, I think he's absolutely right. I think that there's too often, for too long, when we talked about sports, we think of athletes as these abstract entities and not as actual human beings who go through the same things that we all do. Kevin Love was a former teammate of Kyrie Irving and has recently been really open and vocal about his mental health and how he struggled at times. DeMar DeRozan, another player who has done that. And I think now you're starting to see more players be open about it, and that's all to the good. And I think that Kyrie taking sort of a lead there and encouraging other players to do so is a positive thing.
The Osaka case is obviously quite complicated, and because of the way her initial message was delivered, and then her sister had a post, and then her coach said something else, and it was all a bit contradictory. And then on Monday she said, actually, I don't have a problem with the questions I'm asked. It's not about the press themselves, and yet there's still now a big conversation about the nature of press conferences and the questions being asked, even though Osaka herself has literally said it's not the questions I'm being asked, that's not the issue here, it's just the thought of facing the world's media that kind of gets me. But we are where we are, and that conversation about press conferences has kind of started now, and it just won't stop. So, stateside, it seems like a real, like, this is the job. If you're playing professional sport, you're doing media. Not only that, when you're butt naked in the locker room, you're going to be surrounded by cameras as well, and that's just the deal. You know, like, kind of mad power really that journalism has. Is that starting to change? Is the nature of the questioning, do you think it's changed over the years? Is it tetchy? Is it like, you're a terrible player, what are you doing wrong out there? Is it a bit more respectful? Give us your sense of that whole relationship.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation. You and I have talked about this on the show before, about like the nature of athlete media relations and how it's different, and especially in terms of access in the States than it is maybe abroad.
Yeah.
Where, you know, we were saying like, you know, athletes are getting dressed. You just mentioned it. You're getting dressed, and then like, here we are with our tape recorders and our cameras and our microphones, and we're trying to interview them, and then like, that's not usual outside of the United States. And I think maybe the pandemic might have changed part of that. And I'm sort of torn on the Naomi Osaka thing. On the one hand, 1,000%, I think that she's doing the right thing. She should worry about herself. She should worry about her mental health. On the other hand, as a journalist, and this is far less important, but I think that there's room for us to have two thoughts in our head at once. I want still to talk to her, right? And I understand why at times athletes don't want to talk to journalists. I totally understand that. I totally get it. And I'm supportive of it. But there is also a job for us to do. And part of the way that we do our jobs is to interact with them. And Lord knows, Joe, that there are bad journalists out there who ask stupid questions or prying things or are just trying to gain access for access sake. But for those of us who just want to have a normal conversation as people and interact on an interpersonal level, I would be bummed out if we went in a direction where, you know, maybe not press conferences, but just the availability to just have a conversation with somebody waned.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's they're not mutually exclusive points at all. So, Brooklyn Nets, they have a rookie coach, Steve Nash, trying to oversee this whole thing. Is he equipped to handle these big star names and the pressure and to go all the way here? Like I said, Brooklyn Nets are favourites to win the championship outright.
Yeah, I like Steve Nash. He's a really smart guy. I mean, he spent some time with the Warriors when KD was there. He spent time sort of as you could call him like almost an adjunct professor. He was there, but he wasn't really on the staff. But learning from Steve Kerr is a really good way to do it, right? And he saw with those Warriors teams during that mid-aughts or mid-teens dynasty where they had a lot of big personalities who didn't always get along, specifically Draymond and KD. What's it like to manage those guys? Because ultimately, once you roll the ball out there, there's only so much a basketball coach can do. There are set plays, plays out of bounds, and things of that nature. But mostly with basketball, it sort of unfolds organically. So the big part is really how you're managing these personalities. And I think Steve Nash is a really bright guy. He's, you know, we were just talking about interacting with people. He's fantastic to speak with, to interact with. And I think from that managerial standpoint, on how to mesh personalities, he's a good one for this job. Okay.
And just the last one, John, we're talking to John Gonzalez here from The Ringer. The NBA playoffs underway. Defending champions not looking so hot. The Lakers, they're 3-2 down against the Phoenix Suns, best of 7 series, so they're flirting with disaster. LeBron's had some injury issues. Anthony Davis had some injury issues, so they're not quite at it.
Yeah, the health is really the whole thing, Joe. I mean, when Anthony Davis and LeBron are healthy, they're next to unbeatable. I'd love to see them when they're healthy against the Nets, but it doesn't look like we're going to get that right now. Anthony Davis has spent, you know, a large chunk of the season on the mend, and this has been the longest and hardest season for LeBron in terms of injury. I mean, he missed a chunk of time when he's basically an Iron Man in the NBA. He never misses time. So I am reluctant to count out LeBron in any situation, but this certainly looks like an uphill battle for them.
There's a text in. When is Space Jam out?
Not soon enough. This summer. Can't wait.
Okay. You're our go-to guy for the review, okay?
All right. I'm on board with that.
John Gonzalez of The Ringer. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Off the ball on News Talk.